Greetings, family. It's a pleasure to welcome you once again to PSCM or Mojo sessions. And this week we'll be looking at the very contentious topic of slavery and the monuments that has been put up to honor slave traders and people who became very fat of that trade of slavery. We have seen over the last couple of weeks since the murder of Joy Floyd over there in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, in the US, how there's been a groundswell of feeling, things that has been pent up, things that has been held down for so long is now surfacing. And one of those things is very much the vex issue of slavery and what has taken place in its aftermath. I'm sure a lot of you will know how, especially in the British situation, how slave owners were handsomely cons- uh, compensated, whereas the slaves themselves and their descendants did not receive not even one penny. And then to rub salt into the wounds, how the slave owners and traders were handsomely compensated by the British government, who compensated them handsomely for giving up that trade, whereas the slaves and their descendants received not even one penny. And then to rub salt into the wounds, big statues and monuments was then erected all over the UK in order to honor those murderers, those kidnappers, those evil people. Statues, monuments was erected all over the place. Now we have seen it come to a head with the pulling down of Colston in Brixton and his monument being dumped into the harbour. And we know that there are 100 more of these symbols all around the United Kingdom. So the question we are asking today is the symbols of the UK slave trade. What should be done with them? That's the question we'll be putting today. And our speaker today, Brother Washington, will be addressing that question. So what I like to do is shortly hand you over to Brother Washington, who have done a great amount of research into this area. And he'll be putting forward, giving us, enlightening us as to what has been taking place regarding this topic. After which we'll open up for questions and comments. So please get ready to send in your questions and comments because I envisage this to be a very lively debate and discussion. So what I'll do now, I'll bring Brother Washington onto the screen, myself and Brother Washington. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm hearing you clearly. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. So I'll just introduce you to the audience. First, I'd just like you to say just a few words about yourself and your background and as to why you are interested in this topic and something about the research you have been doing, because I know it's a topic that you have been researching for many, many years, after which you can go directly into your presentation. Okay, so I'll hand you over now to Brother Washington.
Okay, listeners, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in cyberspace with the continuation of the Umoja sessions, and looking forward to interact with as many of you this afternoon. I am a teacher by profession, and I also do geoheritage and geopolitics research around the African and the African presence in the UK as a hobby, something I've been doing since I moved to this country. And I have used certain geological and geographical tool of analysis to do my work. And against that background, when I arrived in England some years ago and I landed in Manchester to complete my university course, I began asking certain questions as I noticed the city was pretty much a resemblance of Havana, Cuba in terms of the range of monuments and public display of statues, among other relics and iconic representation of history. I was not surprised that I did not find much representation of the African presence here, but I could understand. I'll get back to that in a moment. So over the last few years, outside of my regular school, college teaching, I teach geography, politics, and computer science. I have also used my community involvement to do research around colonialism, the history of African people and their contribution to the building of the United Kingdom. And I also have an interest in looking at displacement, how as society changes and as governments shift their budgetary location, how does this impact on the African communities? And that has given me a whole new experience in learning more about the organization of public history in this country, how it is displayed. And I don't have to say much of its non-extensive absence from the school curriculum. So my presentation this afternoon is to look at the presence of a range of statues and iconic representations of quote-unquote colonialism, white supremacy in the street of this country, in buildings, not museums, but I'm talking about public buildings, largely offices. And out of work that I have done in Manchester, some in Liverpool, and to a small extent looking at other geography areas in the UK, it is not surprising that the current foray about taking down these statues and replacing them with a reflection of those who are and have contributed to this country building should be revisited and actions now be taken. Prior to all of this, I had made a presentation once to a museum audience looking at the topic Bill by Slavery, and the case study was Manchester. Manchester being part of the Western industrialization is a case in point to look at how the triangular trade of enslavement have enriched and made this area become quite prosperous for several years, decades in fact. And out of that work, the issue of representations of our icons, our ancestors, have been largely missing. I would like to make it very clear that representing structures, they are no mean feat of any human civilization, because over time, they did not, I would say, wherever they are located across the world, there has been a beginning. And such beginning has its place somewhere. And looking at Dr. Ben's book, The Black Man of the Nile, and his family, on page 201, the edition that I have, I'll just read something here to you to give a background as to why societies and why monuments have and has always been a significant part of the historical story wherever a people settlement is involved. And I quote Dr. Ben. I'm looking at an imagery of the Sphinx, and it read, "This is the original Nile Valley African facial characteristic as it appears in Baron Denon, who drew this picture. Before its face was marred in 1798 CE, this statue, the world's largest, was built by the indigenous Africans of the Nile Valley more than 500 years before the Harco-Semites and 1,900 years before the Macedonian Greek Cabanos arrived in Egypt." I am using this as a background to show that even as it stands today, it runs deep in the African DNA, in my opinion, that statues have been a part of us. We revere them, and as Dr. Ben pointed out here, the oldest. So why do we have these statues? In general, across any civilizations, people will advance the argument that A, they help us to keep history and historical experiences while we are alive. In short, they're saying that based on the fact that we are not able to relive much of the experience that a person has had by keeping a statue, that lives in perpetuity, because the materials are usually created as non-destructible materials. They go on, they will experience a range of physical and human, geographic and geological processes, and they stand there. A second argument is that they try to reflect contemporary society. Contemporary society, in my opinion, means people who need to be aware of past experience, need to use these as lessons to move forward, and importantly, to show that you have and are standing on the giants of those who have helped to build before. A third reason is that the statues, particularly those that represent individuals, are a clear reminder that these people were icons. And when you're an icon, you stand out in the crowd. You are revered. And hence, this is what majority of the current discussion is around, is that many of those who are iconized, do they really and should they really be iconized based on their past reputation? And a final reason from my research and my work is that some of these statues were and have been placed where they are to continue the representation of white supremacy. I will look later at the geography of some of the location of our statues. But in representing white supremacy, majority of these statues, A, they are male dominant. B, they are Europeans. C, they are there for a socio-political reason, in that the era in which they represent, and one would possibly want to construe as it exists today, is that it is the Western civilization and the Western way of life which should and is and will be the hallmark through which mankind and his civilization will eventually be so. This is far from a range of documents when you go through. For example, in the work done by Chancellor Williams, where he seminal book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, part 1 of the book, and the first quote reads, "What became of the black people of Summit?" The traveler asks the old man, "For ancient record has shown people of Summer were black. What happened to them?" "Ah," the old man sighed, "they lost their history, so they die." Listeners, if societies, wherever they are, do not ensure that the story is told, that regardless of where white supremacy set, and regardless of the interpretations, if the African, through scholars, through activists, through business people, students, and the ordinary man, do not make a case and continue to demonstrate that we existed hundreds of years ago, the existence of these present-day statues will, in part and parcel, will show that we are in fact dead, meaning we didn't exist. And it's for that reason I would like to draw listeners to Robbins Walker's scholarship piece of work, when we rule. And I'll be coming back to Brother Walker's work in a moment. But I just wanted to set that background that the current uproar about removing these statues and replacing them, or their non-replacement, and or have statues which reflect the correct and a balanced view is essential, because if in the United Kingdom, for example, a stand is not taken where we have seen a demonstration of this art form throughout the country, it is just giving a one-sided view of A, the building of this country, B, a part of their historical experience which they would rather not to be reminded of, and C, the omission, importantly, the omission of Africans from the continent and from the diaspora contribution in all aspects of the UK life: political, economical, social, environmental, you name it. So with that background, I would also want you to bear in mind, I'm going to look specifically at some of the statues and more importantly, the arguments for their removal. When they are removed, what should be their replacement? And if there's no replacement, what adjustment should and could be considered? And we also have to talk about their architectural and their art form in some way, because they are not just placed there because they may have resembled that person. But when you look closely at these structures, there are other markings, there are other features in them which tells more than the eye meets. And that is sometimes why people are outraged when they say that this should be removed, because it's not just a face or a physical feature of someone's attire you're looking at. You're looking at other features that represent so much history, and people who give guided talks about these usually point out a number of small things that you would, as the ordinary person, would not possibly realize that they are themselves a whole piece of education. They are not just bronze or cement and steel, but they represent a big part of public education. So I want to grab a look at one particular statue and go through some of the details of that statue. In general, when you walk the streets of Manchester, a number of the statues that are displayed in Piccadilly, similar to Liverpool, represents male figure. There are few in recent years, they've begun to put some female, but if we cast our mind back to the male figures. So they are male, looking at the architecture, to show you some hidden evidence that is there. Male, dominant. Manchester being for geographical reasons during the height of the triangular enslavement was renowned for its cotton industry. So on these statues, there will be more information about cotton policy, which was a term used to describe the city then. So you'll see something around the text drawing attention to some of the contributions that these people have made. You will also see rose or cotton buds on some of these statues, possible sometimes on the outfit of the persons or part of the plinth on which the statue is placed. You will also see ships as part of their architectural design. And of course, what is normally and will always present is something to the effect that shows that they have contributed significantly to the building of these locations. What is extremely important to me, and what is the current part of the current debate, is that nothing is made mention of a history of why this person and how this person was chosen. And in general, I'm making this statement because largely in the Caribbean, Jamaica, for example, I've been, and I think possibly I may have seen monuments in Guyana and some of the Caribbean islands. They would have was erect as a result of subscription made through public donation for the generosity of the work done by so and such person. This is usually extremely absent from majority of the statues I've looked at. I can't recall seeing this mentioned anything. And it's for that I'm asking, why is this not so? Because in my research, it is not, and I say it is not clearly mentioned from what I've seen, although it is there, that these people made their wealth through the link, either directly and indirectly, with the enslavement of African people during the British period of enslavement. There is an argument that many of these icons that we see now parading in the streets have made their wealth either directly through the trade, which is the shipping of Africans during the period, B, through owning plantation, 3, trading products between the West Indies and England and those who trade from England and the West Africa. So those are 4 general areas through which many of these people, some were involved in all 4 areas, particularly those who were in the transportation business. So these information have been absent from these statues. Another architectural feature that I noticed with these statues, and probably why they create so much public outcry at this time, they are located generally in urban centers and not any and anywhere of urban centers. The choice of their locations were determined by a range of issues. And I'll just mention two. One was the fact that especially the very older ones, where there were not a large number of skyscrapers and traffic of people were quite heavy, it was important that these statues be located there. And as skyscrapers begin to emerge, particularly after the Second World War and more intense, they thought that it was essential that they keep them in full view of people where you are. So as time went on and skyscrapers becoming more city centers, statues were now seemed to be reflecting higher elevations. So wherever you are, they should remind you that they are significant and you should remember them. They represent part of the history of the British culture and the British development. Suffice to say that there are other reasons for their location, which in the question and answer probably we can get onto that. Another issue around those that are located in buildings, town halls, trade centers, near areas of height where we had mills, we had warehouses, and we have a large number of commercial buildings. The Liverpool case in point is quite a few of the iconic statues that exist in the Liverpool area are like in the Cunard building, the town hall. Those are located near the port. And suffice to say, it is reasonable to argue that these statues were placed in some of those buildings because A, the owners and the major shareholders of those buildings were some of the very people who people are, say, taking them down. So these buildings were more an extension of their living quarters. So they themselves, whether through public subscription or when the decisions were made who should we put there, they had voting rights and they had the influence to have them located there. So those located in the interior of the buildings, particularly in Liverpool, which I've seen, some of those buildings were personal areas for the location of some of the people who own those real estate places. A second reason for their location, from what I have come across, is that during and after the eve of the ending of the First World War, and particularly when the great 1923 to 25 economic crisis was ongoing. Public subscription in funding a range of activities was a very, very robust and very well-used fundraising means of getting money to do things. A large number of these contributors were plantation owners and their families. Direct money came from their estate, from their families, and even money that were in what they call endowment funds at the time went towards a range of fundraising activities. And hence, the best way at the time to recognize the people who would have added most to the pot of contribution was to erect a bust, which would be a small version of themselves. And those, in a way, were less costly because quite a few of them have been made out of chalk and material that is not very suitable for outdoor weathering, which is the constant decay of the material through wind, rain, sun, water, all that, those elements and agents of physical, chemical, and biological weathering. So what happens? They were placed in buildings. So right across England, we will see a range of busts instead of large statues existing in these statues, in these buildings rather. And a third contributing factor, while you'll find them in building, is that the architecture at the time, in my opinion, would have begun to copy what they have seen as they explode and as they travel across Africa. And that was a significant feature that you would find in so many of the different iconic buildings in Africa. You would find our ancestors being entombed in personal, what I would call themselves. So you would see images of them reflected there, or you maybe see plaques or some ornament that would have been left there to continue their eternal perpetuity. And when you look at work done by Anthony Broder, for example, he have addressed how England, no exception, have used architectural designs both indoor and outdoor for part of the decor of those buildings. Robin Walker Books also addresses issues around that. And when you go into all of these buildings, you just need to look up. Well, I would like to draw listeners to a particular street in London. Up from the center of wherever you're walking from, of the statues which we're all talking about now. And if you're on your left-hand side, going up towards the Downing Street, and if it's on you're coming from the Nelson column, it's on your right side. There is a particular building, if you're coming from Nelson's Column, the way down after passing the Cenotaph and Downing Street itself, you just need to look on your right, and there are, I think, 7 images carved in the wall, showing or depicting England's link with the rest of the world. And each image brings across either a commercial or a cultural link with the different parts. Interestingly, the link showed England's connection to the continent in Africa is quite disturbing, in my opinion. It may not have been an original feature of the design. However, what is very obvious in that design, there is a clear negative feature. And what is that negative feature? What is there is the person in that image hands have chains on them, and the feet, at some point in time, it seemed as if an attempt was made to possibly cut or remove them, and it's not a pretty sight to see. You will be walking past there not even knowing that on that street, a building connected to Downing Street, there is, and what is representing of us, that we were a people enchained at the time when that monument was created. And hence, the call for removal or a review of where they are located, what they depict, needs to be done. They needs to be done because A, the benefactors represented, whether it be Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, Hull, York, wherever they are, Birmingham, the benefactors, majority of these were their personal desires. How do I know that? And where is that information comes from? While it may be controversial, it is clear from a piece of work I have looked at where a community in Manchester was named after Lord Didsbury. This is a community on the outskirts of the city centre, largely residential and to some amount of soft industries existing there, soft type industries. And I read somewhere in one of his memos that when they were looking at naming places, etc., these missionaries who also were benefactors and those who played a large part in plantation slavery, whether directly or indirectly, they thought that because of their ownership of land in those areas and the work that they were carrying out, it is important that these places be named after them. And If you may have any doubt of what I'm saying, consider how a community, a new housing estate is named in the UK presently. How are they named? If a new estate is being built, the local authority officer goes to the library or some archives and they look at maps going way back, and they will go through the records, look at who were living there, activities that were taking place, and that's how they name these estates. So it has not been changed from then. And hence the argument for their removal, because they are the personal aggrandizement of people who morally and through the creation of their wealth was very, very unwholesome. Many of it created so much bloodshed, illness, loss of people's culture, African people culture, loss of even some of their even own way of life. A second argument for their removal has been when these statues were erected, they were largely funded through professional societies and bodies. And who were these members? The record shows that these friendly societies, first and foremost, had very good libraries. And a large part of their collection would have information, books, and a range of documents that would have reflected Egyptian societies and Egyptians' architecture, buildings, public art. And therefore, these bodies thought, why not rename a street of myself, create a statue and name it in honor of a past president because he contributed so much for the building of the library. I use a library here in Manchester, which was established in 1803 and 1903, I think. And 50% of the collection dates back during a period of extensive exploration of people moving across the world. And of course, there's a section with documents, those big brown bounded copies of information coming back from the continent. So these professional bodies wanted to ensure that their societies reflect what they have seen across areas of Africa. And it is no accident when you look at even how some of the streets here are designed in England. Brother Walker's book, his first chapter, I think, looks at some of the monuments and the geographical layout of areas in different kingdoms across Africa. And what have we seen? We have seen replicas of those here in England. A third reason why the argument is to remove these statutes is that they do not reflect the change in society, or it has omit a part of the building blocks of a society. Now, this is where the controversy is, in my opinion. It is controversial because history is, some historian would say, I think Dr. Ben is one of them, is that everything that is being done today is history. So we need to document it. And the argument is that if we remove these icons who represent so much of colonialism, so much of the treachery and the denunciation of another civilization, the African civilization, for many years. And even if they are removed and placed in a museum and given the proper context, are we not depriving another section of the population who probably will never go to these places or may totally forget that this was part of the British history? And therefore, one line of the argument is that if we take them down, we are denying people of a dark age of the British history, although not fully told, which is being hidden. The other side of the argument is that they represent a true reflection of the atrocities that contribute towards building of England, although it is on the backs of the African wealth then. So therefore, they should stay. What should happen is that they should possibly be updated. I won't draw a conclusion on that point, but I have my own personal conclusion. And the final argument why they should go is that we live in a multi-culture. I'm not sure what that means, honestly. I'm not sure about this multicultural, not sure if, for the want of a better term, I would rather go with a diverse population with people having different cultures. And the current situation is that they do not reflect the changing image of contemporary Britain, and therefore they should go. If contemporary Britain is one whereby we are looking at a population that is no longer just Europeans and pockets of Europeans living with, and in some communities which are predominantly Africans living there, that may be a diverse. But in terms of some of the structural underpinning functioning of the society about diversity and that kind of stuff, the argument still begs, are we truly diverse? So there's then the structural diversity which is hidden. And shouldn't we be more concerned about addressing those structural issues which are present in the diverse society and that is holding us back or holding back the advancement of the African civilization in Britain. And therefore, that is where we should be placing the fight, the energy for their removal. So there's a structural argument which is also underpinning the removal of these statues. So that is the argument for their removal. Why should they stay? To balance my discussion before I conclude. Why should they stay? Is there an argument for that? I began earlier on by saying that statues represented history and historical experiences, and their hope from most of the reading that I've done was to keep history alive so people are aware and therefore are directed to make further judgment. So there are two arguments that I would want to advance why they should stay. The first argument is that they reflect a period of time, experience, and quote unquote contributions of those represented that should never be forgotten by humans, and they should transform, or they should go beyond color, race, creed, sexuality, politics, etc., etc. So they should stand. What is done already is done. Some of them, they are there for good reason. Majority are not. So regardless of that, they should stay. A second argument is that they form part of public education, and I attach to that public art. And no one should interfere with these statues that form parts of someone's skill, some concept that has been thought of to represent an era and a people's lifestyle then. Should that be stomached by everyone? The judgments are, in my conclusion, A, where icons exist in any shape or form and would like or is intended to represent white supremacy, intend to represent the benefactors of those who have gained their wealth through the destruction of others, and here we pause, other cultures, particularly Africans. There should no hiding place for a discussion and for actions to address the distortion of what is written on these plaques, and therefore there need to be serious review around these icons. And a second and concluding argument I would like to make is that where these statues exist across England, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, Hull, Sheffield, you name them, for any reasons where they are going to remain, enough prominence should be given to not just the name that is written on these statues, but closer look should be taken at some of the design features that are there to explain in text, particularly if they are moved to museums, why those were chosen at the time. And those will bring across even a more balanced nature of how the statuarization, if there's such a word, has been used to give a one-sided education over the years for generation. So in addressing the imbalance of these statues and the statuarization debate should go far more than just the name. There are features which tells a story, and these stories are intricately and inextricably linked to how one supreme treacherous rule at the time was able to rule, and those that are advancing the issue of our icons are here to stay and should stay, should make attempt to rightfully, correctly, and honestly give the information. It will create disturbing reading for many of us. And I conclude with that.
Okay, thank you very much, Brother Washington. So you've heard the arguments put why they should stay or why they should not or why they should be taken away. Now, again, this is the interactive platform, so it'd be nice to get some questions from those who are listening. I'll start off by saying,
You're low, brother. I can't hear you.
okay, any better?
Yeah, better now, yeah?
Okay. I'm going to ask a provocative question with the open up. Should we, do you think, be congratulating Black Lives Matters for bringing this topic to the fore? Because let's face it, it's a topic that's been around for many years. There have been many attempts to address this issue, and it has never really captured the public imagination. But after the act that was performed in Bristol, we see now it's one of the main topics for debate. So what do you think in terms
Okay.
of Black Lives
Yeah.
Matters bringing this to the fore? Could I just say, Washi, you're out of camera. Could you
It's
move
okay.
a
Yeah.
bit
Okay.
to your,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
I am smiling because one thing with the struggle and with activism is that it is reactive and that is planned. The reparation question has long been looking and has been arguing that part of the reparation should deal with the matter of statuarization, and not only statuarization, but returning artifacts that were plundered during the era of colonization. What Black Lives Matter response is, it's a reactive, it's not a planned one, and that is where my worry is. Can and will this live on in the foreseeable future? Black Lives Matter, no doubt, has a place and has shown that it is a force to be reckoned with initially, even before the death of George Floyd. For those who have been following Black Lives Matter, it has been taking steps to ensure that here there are some serious issues which needs to be addressed. However, because of how Black Lives Matter, it's as a movement, is organization, I am not sure of its politics, its ideological framework, and importantly, is it about the liberation of African people, or is it about the liberation of people who are old oppressed where they are? And now we are having this thing about there's a new black, I don't know what that is. So in answering to your question, Black Lives Matter surely has done a serious amount of work, and you can't take it away from them that they have been doing some work to make sure that this discussion possibly do not fall on deaf ears and some serious action is taken. So in that sense, you have to give them the kudos. But on the longer term, there are concerns, and it would be useful to be aware of what is the politics of Black Lives Matter. Because, as I said, the reparation questions have brought this to fore, and it's like it's been ignored. Many people who are now talking about Colston and the rest of statute, this is part and parcel of the reparation question, that in order to help us to repair self, nation, family, and community, is that icons that do not represent us and still begin to showcase white supremacy should go. I don't know if Black Lives Matters is addressing that question.
Okay. Um, okay, there was a point that was raised here, which is good to put on the screen, and it's talking about the artifacts that were looted from Africa are now being auctioned off, a lot of them, in these auction houses. So that's something we have to bear in mind. It seems that they have used the cover of what's going on in terms of COVID and so forth, because as you know, a lot of African countries now are asking for these artifacts back. And in some cases, they have been given back, but in very few cases, they have just been given back. I know France is talking about loaning them back and so forth. A lot of countries are doing that. But at the same time, we can see that under the cover of what's happening, they're actually now selling off a lot of these artifacts to private collectors. So that's something that we have to be very, very aware of.
Um, Listeners need to be reminded that artifacts are, they are in themselves who you are, because what they are made of, features that are ingrained in them, and the time frame and text accompanying these, they are left to be legacies. And therefore, it is extremely, as you mentioned, brother, that we should keep a tab out, find out what is happening. There have been UN commissions about how do France, how do Britain work in collaboration with some of these museums and governments back in Africa to get through us returning some of these things. Listeners, I have spent some years ago, one whole day touring, I think, 5 floors of is it the British Museum or something like that? And there were clearly some items that mark gift from the people of so and so, or gift from so. Clearly, people wouldn't give away those stuff. And these are some of the very things that you are mentioning that possibly were acquired through the museum and are now, some of them are in private collections, and they will be ending up in people's private collection. And let me also hasten to say that they are not only relics of history, but they are also items of investment.
That's true. So, what I want to do now is like get back to the whole meat of the issue today. These monuments and statues that has gone up in honor of these slave traders. But just before we get there, I'd just like to remind people that on the ending of slavery, slavery was not ended because they felt sorry for us. In fact, so powerful was these slave traders that they said to the British government, if you want us to stop slavery because it's such a profitable enterprise, you have to compensate us, you know? And in fact, here I can say the British government borrowed 20 million pounds to compensate slave owners, which amounted to a massive 40% of the Treasury annual income, or about 5% of British GDP. The loan was the largest in history. So think about that. Britain took out a loan, the largest ever loan taken out in history, to compensate slave traders and slave owners in order for them to give up the practice of slavery. And what is very little known, that compensation began to be paid out in 1835. And it continued to be paid out until 2015, before those people were fully compensated. Now, how many generations was that? Many generations. So what is that telling us? To me, it's telling us that we, the descendants of those slaves, in paying our taxes and so forth, we were helping to compensate the very people that enslaved our ancestors. That's how crooked this thing is. And then the British government will turn around to us and say it cannot afford to pay us any kind of reparations. So I'd just like to hear your view on that.
Brother Taka, may I say something which is lost in a lot of this discussion?
Hmm.
In 1834, when the act was passed, one island, Antigua, said with all the brutality and the ills of slavery, we are not going the emancipation route. Meaning the plantation owners who had plantation in Antigua would have to be granted, they had to grant full freedom. So where and how did that impact on the British Treasury at the time? So that 20 million that was asked for at the time, it excluded the Antiguan portion of the payment. And those who got there, who did not go through the apprenticeship period in Antigua, the compensation for loss of property, because with another 4 years, those slave masters would have been earning money. So Antigua said, no, we wouldn't go from there. And that money, the treasury had to find additional money to pay the Antiguan owners at the time. And it sends a great discomfort among the plantation owners at the time. And as a result, what has happened then is that the true compensation figure that we are talking about today is not even certain because that has been omitted from the discussion. It is written down.
So what you're saying,
So that this 20 million that you're talking about, it's more than
yeah,
that. Yeah.
well, it just goes to show. It goes to show that money can be found, you know, there's always a case that money can be found. So it's not a case that Britain cannot afford to compensate the victims of slavery. To me, it's a case that they refuse to do it. They do not wish to do it whatsoever. So, couple of points I'd like to bring. I mean, somebody put up a question. Well, it's a point here, basically, that they were just echoing what we were saying, that they were made to pay for it from taxes, and they said they want theirs back. So that's a way that if we as a people was to organize ourselves and say, right, either we withhold our taxes or we withhold a portion of our taxes, right, that were paid to those slave masters that should have went to, also we should have got compensation. I would like to see what response they would have to that, because I really think there's a case there. There's a case for some clever lawyers to take on and argue that, bearing in mind this compensation, it was only a whistleblower in 2015, I think in the Home Office or the Treasury, that leaked it, that it came to light. Otherwise, it was kept totally secret, not for anybody to know. So it'd be interesting to see such a movement come where we say we are withholding taxes for that very reason. Now, coming on, you did talk about the certain monuments and certain statues that surround. And the question is, what do we think should be done with a lot of these things? You made a point that one, they should remain where they are as a point of education, because if they were to be locked away in museums, the vast majority of people do not visit museums, so they would be missing out on education. But thinking about it, Colston was standing there from 1895, I think it was erected, and very few people in Bristol knew the true story, right? Very few people knew the true story about Colston. Or they were taught he was a philanthropist that grew very rich. So if statues are to remain standing and monuments are to remain standing in honor, what do you think should be done to bring an awareness to the general population as to who these people really are?
Um, Look, if they are going to be remain and rebranded with information, it's going to left, in my opinion, a lot of sadness for those who bought into the idea that this person was a philanthropy and they did this and they did that. And we have benefit from that. School have been named after them because they do this and that. Yeah, we can go on and say that. But what we need to look at is there is this issue about a picture tells 1,000 words. And those icons, they are drawing, and the first thing that people are probably thinking, even without reading anything, is that for it to be there, it must be a positive contribution, which in a sense, it's not always true. So updating it with the text and all that kind of stuff, it will not change the course of what the Black Lives Movement and others before Black Lives Movement have been saying, i.e., they have been creators of ill will. They have amassed their wealth through A, skullduggery means, B, exploitation. Much of it wasn't done by fair means. Therefore, there shouldn't be an argument. Why should you continue to revere this person icon in public view? And you're saying that you want your society to reflect one whereby people go out and when they look in an atmosphere, they feel that they are somewhere where it represents the contemporary society.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Well, so another question I'd like to ask: the benefactors of this compensation, now that it's out in general, because it was only about 2015, 2014 that it came out when University College London, there was a professor that started doing some work, and he said he just came across it. He stumbled across it, actually. He went to Kew Gardens, as you know, where the National Archives is kept, to do something, and end up stumbling across these things. And then, as you know, then that was let out of the bag, and then David, I think his name David Alisolo.
Yeah, the
That's
professor.
yeah, that historian then took it up, and the TV series was made about it, how Britain compensated all these people. Now, the wealth was imaginable that these people inherited. Now that it's open, do you think there should be a movement for these people to, if not pay the entirety of it back, to be taxed in some kind of way, and then the proceeds of those tax go to the descendants of those slaves who truly was the one to be compensated?
Well, that is one of the arguments that is on the reparation question. There is no doubt that the monetary element of the reparation question is that A, the loss of earning, B, compensation given for people who you said you once owned, who were taken from Africa under forced conditions, and C, we were not responsible for that. So why should we pay it back? I differ. There should be, as part of the reparation question that regardless of who contributed towards any compensation, there must be some recompensation for injustice. One of the arguments why it should not be paid back is that these guys were our ancestors. They were the property of these slave owners. So how can you recompensate someone when you take away their property? There were no, who in the first place made our ancestors the property of the white Europeans, settlers? Not us. So we were taken away. So it was theft. And therefore, repayment needs to be made. You take something which is not yours, it is only just in the natural order of things that it be returned. And further, it should not only be repaid, but it should also take into consideration the inflationary aspect to it. When those people were granted emancipation in 1834 initially, and how did they calculate this 20 million? It takes into consideration the growth rate at which the economies were performing at the time and how much loss would have been incurred to end slavery before 1838. So a similar viewpoint and a similar mechanism must be attached to the compensation question, whereby the inflationary index must be added to the compensation package. Do you follow?
Yes, yes. I follow that. But the next thing I would like to say now, what role do you think, I put inverted commas, governments? Let's start with the governments in the Caribbean,
Yeah.
because there was a famous incident when in 2015, I think it was, David Cameron visited Jamaica and Portia Simpson asked him about reparations. And then he replied, happened a long time ago, forget about it, just move on. But by the way, I do have something I would like to offer, and that is £25 million toward the building of a prison. You see? So it shows to me, one, they see those governments as jokers, because until this day, they cannot get their act together to put forward a cogent argument for reparations, right? One. So first, let's take the Caribbean governments, and then next we'll move on to the African governments. So let's take
Yes.
the Caribbean
Okay.
governments now. What do you think their
Oh,
approach should be?
right. The first thing with Caribbean governments, and particularly Jamaica, who, when it coughs, the rest of the Caribbean, with the exception of Cuba, catches a cold. When a government refuses to teach the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Mosiah Garvey in school, or to educate its population about the contribution of that man, you don't have to look very far that they are still part and parcel of the colonial mindset through which we have gained some political independence, and therefore not much is to be expected in pushing the reparation question. At the moment, CARICOM is doing a reasonably good job, in my opinion, based on their budget resources and some of the personalities who they have are pushing towards getting reparations and even address some of the issues around, even since the Black Lives Matter starts about taking down statues and so on. Some amount of work is being done there, but the Caribbean governments are A, still warped in a colonial mentality, B, they are not prepared to take a unified approach towards the question of dealing with anything of post-colonialism or neo-colonialism and say, hey, you have done us wrong. Slavery was inhumane. It has set us back so many, many years. Do something. Let me give you a case in point. When Michael Manley came to power in 1972, do you want to guess what population of the country could not read and write? And that was what, 8 years, 10 years after independence. No investment was made in the country following the ending of the slave trade after the war and a number of other seminal colonial activities after the ending of the slave trade. The British were not engaging, prepared to ensure people even get a decent academic education. Over 65% of Jamaicans were unable to read and write. That set back a whole generation. And even then, with the best will of Michael Manley trying to do a revolutionary program, similar to what Cuba did under Fidel Castro when he became the president of Cuba in the 1957, 56, 57 revolution, was to ensure that everybody became literate. Michael Manley trusted in the Jamaican people, said, let us learn to read and write. There has never been an active national program. And if majority of the Caribbean countries have ever taken on a revolutionary step to be dealing with any kind of payment, any kind of investment on a structural basis from the British government, it would have happened, but that has never been. I have seen work where Jamaica has bauxite, Trinidad has oil, and all the technical work has gone through whereby we could be doing smelting in Trinidad and therefore own the end product, aluminum, and it would have transformed the entire Caribbean. But what has happened? The colonial mentalities in governments at the time would not go full with such an investment. And let us carefully look at what is going to happen in Guyana. Oil is now found in commercial quantities in Guyana. It is appalling at the economic arrangements which have been agreed so far for Guyana to get. I think let's be 20 pence, not sure if it's 20 pence, 20p out of every dollar. And that is appalling, or maybe even less. And it is because, again, we are mindset that, here, look, instead of us owning our resources and managing it, no, it is because we have been set into this colonial mentality and white supremacy, both politically and structurally, continues to be a dominant part of their governance. Portia Simpson, before she became the prime minister at her second term, she did make an all sweeping national, something which goes international, that if she is elected again as a prime minister, she is going to remove the head of state who is represented by a governor general and let the country becomes a republic. She spent another 5 years in office and nothing was done. So those are the dilemmas we face. The leaders are not taking that bold step. There is something which is holding back that bold step which is required for the activation and the activities of practical step to free up these places.
Yeah, I agree. So Carrying on the Caribbean theme for the moment. So as you say, you think it's the mindset because you give the
Yes,
example of Jamaica still having a governor general who, in theory, can sack the prime minister.
yes. Mhm.
Yes, the governor general has that power. So unlike Trinidad, say, that has become a republic,
Guyana also.
Guyana,
Yeah. No,
Jamaica
but
is very much at the whim of the British government still. Now, the other thing I was going to say, I know we title UK symbols of slavery, but as we say, because Jamaica still have a governor general, meaning that it's still not a truly independent state. Now, I'm looking at the symbols of slavery that's in the island of Jamaica itself. And we can start at the beginning with the one who started it all, Christopher Columbus. Now, you know what I'm going to say?
in Jamaica, there's a
You go to
Christopher
Discovery
Colombo.
Bay, and who do you see looking out? Christopher Columbus. So, what's your
Uh,
thought?
right.
It's always good to start at the beginning. So, don't
Yeah,
you think Christopher Columbus should be removed, especially in this climate? I hope somebody in Jamaica is listening to
yeah,
me. I would like to
yeah.
see Black Lives Matters out there go and pull down Christopher Columbus as a start.
Brother, many years ago, I worked with some archaeologists. They were from Mexico. I'm doing some archaeology dig in civil in St. Anne. And because of my interest in history and heritage, I was engaged with those who spoke English. And we had a discussion about, what were they looking for, etc. And though they were English, the heritage, the Spanish, etc., they were aghast that Sam Sharp Square, Little Orchard as you move along, all the different areas you move in Kingston, what did they see? They see statues across Christopher Columbus. You have Simon Bolivar. I could name so many of those who were connected to the Atlantic slave trade were still there. Christopher Columbus lost his navigational aids and ended up across the Atlantic, initially to Dominica Republic, and when he came on the natives there who were the Arawak Indians at the time, how can you claim you discover people here? This very book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, recounts with absolute authoritative evidence that African people were in North and South America, the Caribbean, before Columbus came. So how on earth can you still have a statue of this man? You're still, even at some levels of university discourse, his thought is still being considered as part of curriculum, which is nonsense. The man lost. He lost. It's clearly lost. Because even I study a lot about ancient maps and navigational work during um, 17th, 18th century. And there were no time when the Portuguese were moving in across Europe. There were any discussion that came across, when you look at all these maps, it's like North and South America were never part of their projections of those maps, because the Mercator projection of the map, which sadly we are mainly using today, is telling us that the largest part of the world that exists was Europe. And therefore, why bother to think about other? So he ended up in that part of the world. First and foremost, when he realized that it was so sparsely populated, he thought that as an explorer was to conquer it. And the bloodiest city that existed in the Western Hemisphere to date, Port Royal, which is situated in Jamaica, was as a result of Columbus. It was a result of Columbus. So why should you have a statue of that man in your place? You know, he should be one of those who should be considered as dead, as Dr. Ben pointed out in the excerpt that I wrote that not having these people there, you consider them as dead. They don't exist. And as I talk about ICANN, I've traveled quite to a number of the other Caribbean islands. And what manifests itself so much is how much of England representation you will find across Spanish Town, in Barbados, Guyana. I have seen them in quite a few of the other islands I've been to on public display. Because as I mentioned earlier on, where public subscription was at the time and these professional societies, they were made up of people from the plantation class.
That's right.
And who's going to
Okay.
tell that story?
Okay. Another thing, just before I go on to the African governments. Now, take for instance Jamaica. I think it's something like 95% of the population is direct African descended people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you just mentioned in terms of you go and you see the British icons, the British legacy left over. Do you think there's a case? I'm using Jamaica because that's what I'm mostly familiar with. For us to start renaming, right? Renaming many of the places. Because, for instance, Jamaica is made up of, what is it? Cornwall, Middlesex, and Surrey. If I'm right. And then as we go around the island, what do we get? You know, what do we get? So that's a nonsense because you see, the most powerful thing is the psychological impact on us. So if we grow up in a 95% African society place, country, and yet everything we see around us relates back to England, say Britain, or if not to Spain, that had the island before the British took it over. What of Africa can we see around us in our daily life? Very,
Brother,
very little.
yeah. Let me say something about these renaming before I
Mhm.
touch on Jamaica. There is a small housing estate here in Manchester that all the streets name are named after West Africa names and places in West Africa. And I was told that it happened because when they had pushed down a part or they were redeveloping an area in Mosside, a large number of African students were living in those areas, and the people at the time had the consciousness of knowing what a name represent in terms of, have a stake of our contribution. And the city council bow, and that area were renamed with West African names and so on. It's a small area, probably less than maybe 150 houses. And I'm saying that to that. I live into a community in Kingston where the entire area, maybe over 3,000 houses, all the streets are named of the royal family alone. In Trelawney, the capital Falmouth, all the streets name of royalties. Right across the Caribbean, all of what we call in geography, the central business district area where you find the banks, insurance companies, major shopping malls, attorneys, the financial district, they are all named Duke Street, King Street, Queen Street, Albert Street, William Street. Where are those
Mhm,
coming from?
mhm, mhm.
They came directly from the masters of the enslaved. And as I pointed out in the talk earlier on, how are these places named? So there is no difficulty for people in Jamaica, for example, can go back to Almond Town. Almond Town is totally named of the royalty. And then look at a figure who has contributed well in that community, a family who has lived there for many years, and rename the streets. But do they have that mindset? Do they want to upstore the apple cart? I don't think so.
Well, that's it. Well, that's why I agree. That's why I think reparations, as it's being approached, is a joke. Because if you have such a mindset, how can you ask for reparation and be taken seriously? They know if you can't even reclaim your names, why should anybody take you seriously when you ask for reparation? And I think that's where a lot of us are missing the point. These people, by what I mean, the Europeans who we're dealing with, works very much on a psychological plane. And they make an assessment depending on how they see us move. If you look at Africa, when countries was gaining their so-called independence, the countries that were quick to take on, get rid of the colonial names and retake an African name, you saw the approach to them was much different from the approach to those who held on to those colonial names. And I think that's why in the Caribbean, we are doomed to fail in terms of reparation or
But
approach to reparation. That also goes to the groups in this country,
yeah,
in the UK, asking for reparation. Until we can become more African centered, we will not be taken seriously.
okay, Brother Taka, reparations in
Mhm.
the Caribbean has been hijacked by the bourgeoisie, right? That is the first point. With the Rastafarian, I knew that word probably before I was maybe 10 years old. How did I know it? Because it was a Rastafarian in the rural parts of Jamaica who I got my first lectures from about reparations. Yeah.
Mhm.
And when those
Oh, okay. Seeing that Brother Washington has gone off the line. Let's see. Until he comes back, let's carry on the discussion. Hopefully, he'll get back in soon. As we were saying about the slaves and slave master, and now these monuments and icons put up to them. You see, they're so, to me, these people are so secure within themselves. They've studied us so much that they know that we would not campaign to pull them down as a group of people. Even though Colston has been pulled down say, for instance, in Bristol because of what he represented, there's still many of African people saying he should not have been pulled down. They are following the argument of their former colonial masters still. They're following that argument that Colston was a man of his time. During his time, slavery was a legal entity. So whatever was done then should be forgotten, which is absolute rubbish. So it's like they've studied us. They know our minds. That's why they toy with us. And I hope Brother Washington gets back on, because one of the things that I would like to have brought up now is the approach. We talked about the Caribbean governments. Now the approach of the African governments. Do we think the governments in Africa should be sending out messages and demanding that Britain respect the past in terms of what was done by contextualizing a lot of these figures and monuments that has been put up. And if they don't, well, at least the governments in Africa could start by incorporating into the curriculums which they teach in school more of an Afrocentric approach. Because as we know, British education is in great demand in Africa and all over the world. And people will forego their own heritage and teach propaganda to their people in order to seek favor with a country such as this. So again, I go back to my statement about reparation.
Yeah.
And I say to many of these reparation groups that until we take ourselves seriously, we will not be taken seriously. And one of the moves in taking ourselves seriously is reclaiming names that we have lost, is to rename wherever we control and make those names be a reflection of ourselves. Yes, Brother Washington, you're back on?
I'm back on.
Yeah.
Yes, so I was saying that the reparations movement, in my opinion, has been hijacked by the bourgeoisie.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, in Jamaica, for example, when the Rastafarian movement started to talk about back to Africa, the Marcus Garvey opinions and philosophy, they were on this thing whereby governments thought that these people were just not ready for it. They were not intellects. They were not from the urban centers. They were not from known families. And therefore, when even in the 60s, when the government penalized the Rastafarians, now which only recently a public apology and compensation are now being made to some of those relatives, if there and then, if the movement, reparations movement, was given that kick, given that support, it would have been a different ball game, because these were people who were driven by a philosophy that what we can do, we will do it as part of the reparation movement. It's the Rastafarian people who started the thing in Jamaica of naming children with Africans' name. That is part of self-repair. It is a Rastafarian talking
Right.
about vegan food. It is a Rastafarian who talking about political parties that were representing the Westminster type of democracy should go away. And for that reason, why Michael Manley became so popular with the Rastafarian movement was his embracement of I Selassie first. In addition to, he had thrown some weight behind some of the ideals of reparation, which the Rastafarian were saying that, look, if you support I Selassie, we will vote for you. And shortly after he came to power, the bourgeoisie hijacked the reparation movement. Now it sits in CARICOM. Who is at CARICOM? Who is at CARICOM? Intellectuals. Those guys are afraid to bell the cat, the elephant in the room. They don't want to deal with it. Closer home here in England, the situation is that there has been fragmentation with regards to the liberation movement, because the people who are responsible for reparations in this, there is so much complication. At the forefront of it, some of them are in a situation where many of us are in mixed relationships. I am not. Many of us are include where our parents who are here do not, and we don't want to anger the family, so we do not take certain positions, even naming our children the way how we should name them, and ought to be naming, because we don't want to give them any name because our granny and our sister and our brother are going to be offended if we name them Taka, if we name them Kofi, all that kind of stuff. And therefore, the fragmentation which lies here, it's a deep-rooted situation whereby the migrants from the Caribbean and those from Africa who has been spearheading it here have not been able to find a common ground. How are we going to move this? Are we going to push it via the teachings of Marcus Garvey? Secondly, we're going to push it via an economic driver, whereby we are saying if we can establish an economic front, whereby we can then begin to show some people that some of us who are self-repair are doing so much with an Afrocentric way, or we are going to go back to Africa or in the Caribbean and invest there so other people can follow through. And more importantly, part of the self-repair is to take a steadfast, painful action to support our Black economy. And those are some of the reality the movement faces here. So the self-repair is an issue, and therefore the larger agenda cannot be pushed. The march, I think, is a very good initiative. So at least you're bringing across to the public that, look, we are still, regardless of the numbers being going down, we are still aware that we have been done wrong and we need to be compensated. Our wrongs need to be addressed, just as how the Israeli have had reparations addressed. We need to have ours. What makes them, under the natural order of things, more human than you and I and our mothers and fathers and our ancestors? They do breathe in oxygen, just like you and I. So the point you're making, where even small steps, where self-repair needs to be happening, when we begin to show that, and many more families are taking self-repair as part of the reparation journey, and that filters out into the community, then leadership will be able to galvanize around that. And people won't be asking, why are they marching, or why they continue to march? We have been hearing this, and we have been hearing that for a long time. But don't feel disheartened that every liberation struggle, when it comes on to the African question, it has been bloody, it has been long, and it may seem that there is no hope, but we should fight on.
Okay. No, I would say that's very apt. I'm getting yeah, because being as you're a teacher, and teaching children, and you can see how minds are molded. I would say that, as you say, it was the Rastas that first started using African names to name their children. And at first it was resisted. And I remember when it became more generally accepted, how there were big arguments within families. Why are you naming your child X, Y, and Z? It's not because we developed very much. We had a Eurocentric mind. A lot of us did not want to admit that. We thought we was free thinkers. We thought yes, but we did not realize just how indoctrinated we were. And I would say it again, until we can rediscover our Africanness, we will not be taken seriously. How can John Smith go to John Brown and ask for reparation?
Uh,
Does that make any sense?
it
Because they're
doesn't.
looking at us and they're saying, Europeans has been in Africa, say for instance in South Africa, for well over almost 400 years, and never did they take on African names. Never did they take on African names. What they did when they moved, in fact, the towns that they came from, they would rename wherever they settle that name. Their very culture, the very names of their towns, they would bring with them and implant it there. Yet
Brother,
now
I am doing
we're in
some work.
control. Huh?
I'm doing
Yeah,
some
carry
work
on.
around. I'm doing some work around my family history, and one of the things that struck me was when I caught up with one of my grandfather's relative, and when all the first names, well, everybody named William Smith, Johnson, Barrett, all that. But when I look back at my grandfather's first name, his father's first name, who they could recall, and all
Mhm.
those two generations passed by, their first name was all African, Bai,
That's right.
some kind of name. So what has happened? The name, if that tradition had continued, maybe I wouldn't have this. My name is an American. My first name is an American, and my second name is English. And my middle name is French, I was told. I have checked it, and I think it's a French name. How do you explain it? And I'm African.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. It's for us to take matters into our own hands and be proactive. And I think once we're seen to be proactive, when we do go to negotiation table, we will then be taken more seriously.
Brother Taka, let me tell you one case in point where Jamaicans changed the world. And that has to do with the bauxite level when we went around the negotiation table. When the issue of the levy, how much the American and Canadian company should pay Jamaica for mining the bauxite, the negotiation table had some of the best minds you could find as conveyance lawyers and baristas around the table, and economists, and a few politicians around the table. And they had to face the might of American and Canadian top legal luminaries. And the discussion went on and on and on. And when they realized that the Jamaican was winning the argument and they were not going to move from where they are, they eventually succumb and decide to pay that levy, the charge that would be paying to Jamaica. And it's for that reason why the International Bauxite Association headquarters was located in Jamaica, and it is documented whereby their white counterparts have said in secret meetings that they have never seen a group of black people were so able to deliver what they want and stuck to their gun. We have to watch out for them. So the point you're making, if people take things in their hands, it can happen.
Of
So
course.
Black Lives Matters, depending on the ideology that is driving it, in my opinion, and what they want to see happen with this whole statuarization of England, America, Jamaica, Barbados, Ghana, etc., etc. If there is a political ideology which is saying that it must done away, it should not be there to remind us of white supremacy, both structurally and politically. If that is ideology what is driving it, they will go down. But if that is not driving it, all we're going to see, they're going to take off this plaque off them, get the academic to rewrite it, and end the story.
Okay, okay. And I know time is coming up, but my final point is this. It's entitled UK slave symbols. What can be done about them? Now, we in this country, tiny minority, so we can make up as much noise as we can. But unless the majority population stand up and said, we want to do something about it because, that's how we feel now, I think we are wasting our time. We should concentrate our effort into places which we can afford immediate change. Hence, when Cecil Rhodes' statue in Zimbabwe was brought down, that's something we could demand and it could happen because we are the majority. In South Africa, in all around Africa, if such colonial items are up, they can be brought down tomorrow like that because we are in the majority. Now, as we mentioned, Black Lives Matters, we saw when that statue came down of Colston in Brixton, who took it down?
Right.
Who were the people that pulled it down? Who were the people that rolled into the harbour? There were very few black faces there. And I'm just
Okay.
saying that's what we got to get in our minds that, yes, in this country, we have very, very little influence.
Okay. Representation in getting any change to statuarization in England is going to be difficult because we have seen that democracy, the route for democracy, had failed in Bristol. The people were going through the normal way you call meetings, you take minutes, you give your views, vote. Were the normal man who against that present in those discussions? We can argue no. Were black people there or representations, the mayor there, who is a ceremonial figure at the moment, he cannot ruffle so much because he has to represent everyone in the city, although he's black at the moment. You may have other councillors. They are not in a position to do much. And therefore, the argument that is being put forward is that democracy has failed in dealing with the removal of these statues, and therefore, that is the reason why force took it down. It was largely white people we saw who were taking this thing down, rolling it over into the harbor. And you probably are asking, where were other people? History will show that the proletariat, most of the time, they're the ones who push the fire, but they are not going to be the one who press the button because the proletariat have so much to lose in the revolution compared to the bourgeoisie. And what we are seeing there, although those white people who took down that statue clearly are members of the proletariat class, structurally, they still have more than the black man. And it is for that reason why, even though George Floyd has caused and has influenced much of what is going on, until the proletariat get some power or feel that they are going to be empowered, we will not see serious change with the statues.
That's right. That's and just coming up to the end. That's why I mentioned before. We dealt with the Caribbean governments. What about the African governments? Because to me, that's where the solution lies. When we're
Um,
talking about African people now, when we're talking about African people as a whole, when we're talking about reparations as a whole, to me, that's where the solution lies. Because you'd only have to look at, say, India or China, and there are millions of Indians living outside of India. There's millions of Chinese living outside of China. But because as an entity, India and China is in the big league, they're playing the big league, and when they talk, they have to be listened to. They get results, right? They get results. So until Africa start dealing in the big league, we, the diasporan African, will see no results. Because why should they take us seriously? So yes, we can have a little tokenism here or there, but we're talking generally. So again, I would like to say to all those who are fighting for reparations, if Africa is not fully involved, you're going nowhere, right? To me, that's the reality. You're going nowhere. They'll pay lip service to you for the next 1,000 years and you'll get nothing. Yeah.
Uh,
So to
but
me, that's what I'm saying. The focus is on Africa. I don't know what you're just
yeah,
to
but
wind up now.
yeah, just to
Yeah.
wind up, I'll just make a comment about Africa and then I wind up. But the question of Africa has to be in the big league. There is no
Mhm.
doubt about that. And the African government is being told, regardless of, I don't know if they're listening, and what is happening, that you have a significant numerical majority that is capable, comfortable to do what can enact change. In the heat of the Brexit discussion, I can remember one parliamentarian from the Conservative Party said, forget about Europe. Nigeria alone has a market, and I say a third time, a market which we can tap into that Europe doesn't have. So what you're saying about Africa, continental Africa, stepping up and be a big player, I fully agree that if they decided that they are going to take on the reparation question with the proletariat mindset at the United Nations, we will see reparation taking place. And there are those in the entertainment industry who who live in the diaspora and in Africa, who can help to mobilize diaspora Africans from government right through to say, look, it is time that we put the reparation question to the magnitude and give it the momentum which is needed. Yeah.
Yep. Well, I fully go along. And I'd just like to end by saying when Bernie Grant was around and he got involved, and then Abiola in Nigeria got involved, and the movement was very much towards continental African becoming fully on board. It was ironic how the demise of both of them, followed very closely. And since that demise of, say, Abiola, there's been a little tiptoeing of people on the African continent. There's been this reluctance to get involved because we even had the situation where I think at the time it was Ablaye one of Senegal was saying, well, we're in a difficult position because his own family were involved in the slave trade, catching and selling his own people. So, that's something that we have to discuss, but there's no doubt about it. I would just say the focus is on Africa. Don't get sidetracked because my thing is these statues, yes, they're there. Educate yourself. It don't take too much to go around and seeing who they are and finding out about them and then educate your children and educate your community. But expending so much energy now going around saying this must come down, that must go there, that must stay there. That energy could be better spent, I would say, in focusing on Pan-Africanism and trying to engage governments in Africa to have more of a holistic outlook and embracing more fully the Africans in the diaspora and taking up a lot of the agenda that we have, because we saw Malcolm journeyed into Africa and persuaded certain governments at the time to take up the issue of what was happening to Africans in the diaspora to the point that they was bringing up things at United Nations. And that's the level that we need to now move towards and get towards. And don't be sidetracked, because like I'm saying, we are a tiny majority in these countries. Maybe apart from the United States, when although they're a minority, they're a significant minority. But if we if our concentration is more on Africa and trying to galvanize the governments into taking up the agendas that we have, I think we could get a lot more done much faster, and we could be a lot more effective in what we're doing. So again, Brother Washington, I'd like to thank you. for enlightening us with the knowledge that you have spent many years putting together. And this is a topic that I think we're only scratching the surface, because there's so much more to come. There's so much more to be known. Because every time we walk around the streets of London, Birmingham, Manchester, there are significant symbols of our past that we do not really recognize. And we need somebody like yourself to study them and bring that knowledge to us. So I hope that it won't be too long that you can come back and we can continue this discussion.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you got any last word just before we
It's
end.
just to say, statuarization in England here as it stands, don't get trapped into the quote unquote all these reviews and demonstration and illegal acts of moving things what are not there. The focus should be Pan-Africanism. The focus should be one whereby we look to the center of where our legacies have emanated from and have built the backbones of Western economies. We still have that power. It is us to find that and re-examine ourselves and make sure that the reparation question as part of the Pan-Africanism pursuit is not lost.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again. And thank you very much to all our viewers again. So next week we'll be back again at 6 o'clock and Sunday with another very interesting topic for you. So until then, I wish you all good night.